Erev Shabbos, the day before Shabbos. And there's an expression in Gemara, Misha Tarach be'erev Shabbos, yoichal b'Shabbos. The one who prepared before Shabbos, he has what to eat on Shabbos.
Oh, have a microphone here. Is there a microphone? Go ahead.
Yeah. And though the interpretation of the Gemara is Misha Tarach be'erev Shabbos, not necessarily to Erev Shabbos, but it means preparations for Shabbos that can be done throughout the entire week, and the entire week is considered like Erev Shabbos.
Is there a microphone? Go ahead.
Yeah. And though the interpretation of the Gemara is Misha Tarach be'erev Shabbos, not necessarily to Erev Shabbos, but it means preparations for Shabbos that can be done throughout the entire week, and the entire week is considered like Erev Shabbos. However, the Rebbe says, usually when we refer to Erev Shabbos, we mean the Friday. And this is Minig Yisrael as well, that by Erev Shabbos, usually we refer to the day right before Shabbos. This week, today is Gimel Nisan, 3 days in the month of Nisan. So Friday, Erev Shabbos, was Beis Nisan, 2 days in the month of Nisan. What is the significance of 2 days in the month of Nisan, Beis Nisan, to us? So the Rebbe goes on, really there are two inyanim which took place on Beis Nisan. However, for some reason, one inyan is very popular, and we constantly refer to one of the inyanim, and another one of the inyanim which has taken place on Beis Nisan, we cannot don't refer to it. What is it? On Beis Nisan, it is the day when the Frierdiker Rebbe's father, the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Reb Shalom Ber, passed away. And this, he says, is something which is known by Hasidim always. We always refer to this day as the date when the Frierdiker Rebbe's father passed away. However, there is something which also took place on Beis Nisan, and as the Rebbe says, this other thing has a stronger, is much more meaningful to us than the first inyan. And for some reason, this other thing, the second thing, is not that much popular. What is it? It's the fact that automatically, by the Rebbe Rashab's passing away, this means that the Frierdiker Rebbe accepted his leadership, his Nesias, automatically right after his father passed away. Because of the fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe was a Ben Yochid, he was the only son, so this makes it automatic that the leadership goes over from his father, the Rebbe Rashab, to the son, the Frierdiker Rebbe. Rebbe said that in the Gemara, Masechta Hoyriyes, it's Gemara, and Rebbe added on that Hoyriyes also is Meloshen Hoyrah. That means that all the inyanim that are discussed in this Masechta are a Hirah, are a teaching for us as well. And in that Masechta, one of the inyanim which is discussed is the fact that when a son takes over leadership, whether it is a king or a nasi, from his father, then the son does not need no meshicha, no ointment. Normally, if there would be any argument about his leadership, in other words, there would be differences of opinion if this son should take over leadership from the father, whether we're talking about Melucha or we're talking about Nesiyas, then the son would require Meshicha. However, in the case where it is automatic, in the sense that there's no one arguing and everyone is agreeing that this son should take over leadership from the father, or in a more particular case where the son is an only son, as we're talking in the case by the Frierdiker Rebbe and his father, the Rebbe Rashab, that the Rebbe Rashab was the father to the Frierdiker Rebbe who was his only son. So in such a case, leadership goes over automatically to the Frierdiker Rebbe. When did the Frierdiker Rebbe accept his leadership? And as the Rebbe kept on stressing, the Frierdiker Rebbe, as the Nasi Dareinu, the leader of our generation, which the day of his acceptance of Nesiyas is something which should be very meaningful to us, all this took place on Beis Nisan. And this is the second inyan which took place on Beis Nisan, which is something which should be extremely meaningful to us. And at the same time, the Rebbe says it's bypassed and not much attention is paid to the fact that Beis Nisan is the day that the Frierdiker Rebbe accepted his leadership. And as the Rebbe went on, he says, in the year when a taka took place, when the Frierdiker Rebbe became Nasi, he taka automatically became Nasi on Beis Nisan. However, there were halachic inyanim which were also involved. The fact that he had to sit Shiva after his father, and there's an inyan of Shiva, and there's an inyan of Shloshim as well. Though Shloshim, in this case, was not for full 30 days because of the fact that the Yont of Pesach came in the middle. And Pesach is mevatel to Shloshim. As we know, the halacha is that when a yontif comes in the middle of the shloshim, it breaks the shloshim. There's no longer a continuity to the shloshim. However, back in this particular case, this was only a one-time inyan. In that particular year, there were inyanim, side inyanim that held up for the leadership to come into action till after the Shiva and so forth. However, in the following years, when we celebrate this, and as we know in all inyanim and Torah, there's a concept of hayamim ha'elu niskarim v'nasim, that these days are reminded, and when these days are reminded properly, it's a pasuk in the Megillah, when these days are reminded properly, then all the inyanim that took place in these days reoccur again in the spiritual sense, are re-strengthened again and reoccur again. So Mamela, in this case, this is the day that the Frierdiker Rebbe began his leadership. Rebbe also added that there are other communities where it is a custom that when one becomes Rebbe, when one accepts leadership, right away, as soon as his father, whatever the case may be, his father passes away, he is greeted with Mazel Tov. For the fact that the Mazel Tov is for him becoming a leader, for him becoming a Nasi, a Rebbe. Rebbe added on, however, in Chabad, doesn't seem that there's a custom of greeting Mazel Tov to the Rebbe, like what we're talking now in the case when the Frierdiker Rebbe accepted Messias. It doesn't seem that there was an inyan of wishing him Mazel Tov. At least the Rebbe added on, there was no wishing Mazel Tov publicly. However, the inyan still stands that this was the moment when he automatically accepted leadership. After whom? After his father, the Rebbe Rasha. Bichlal, we know by Yidden, the Rebbe goes on, that there's an inyan that anything and everything which occurs by a Yid and which a Yid hears has to have some sort of a reflection in Avodas Hashem. As we refer to the famous pasuk, B'chol d'rochecha da'ayu, in all your ways you shall know him, which means, what's the pshat in all your ways? Meaning that any inyan which you hear, anything which can be considered d'rochecha, da'ayu has to be utilized of the das as Hashem. Has to be utilized in the service of the Rebbe. So as the Rebbe went on, when we're talking now about the inyan of the Rebbe Rashab, Frierdiker Rebbe's father, we must find some inyan benegay the Frierdiker Rebbe's father, which all of us can take a heroa out of. So if we are going to talk in his Torahs and the teachings of the Rebbe Rashab, the teachings of the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe says, are primarily in Yonim and Chasidus and Pnimiyus HaTorah, and this is something which naturally not everyone is equal to have an even understanding b'negei the Torahs of the Rebbe Rashab. There are some that will have a better understanding, and there are some who cannot have that of a well understanding in his teachings. B'negei his minhagim, b'negei his customs, obviously it would also be the same. However, the Rebbe says there is one inyan which is equal to each and every one, which everyone can learn it and derive a lesson from the Rebbe Rashab. What is this? This is the name. What was his name? His name was Shalom Doiv Ber. And the Rebbe went on to explain a heroya which we can all take from a name. And as we see, the Rebbe says a name is something which is by each and every person, not taking into consideration into his qualifications or his talents and so forth. As soon as a child is named, a baby is an infant, a boy is an 8-day-old baby, and this is as when is a baby named? By his bris. And as the Alter Rebbe explains in Shulchan Aruch, that is when it's the knisas nefesh hakdusha by a child is by a bris. So we see that a name is something which comes at a very early childhood, and it comes by everyone equally. The Rebbe added on, even prior to the giving of the name. In other words, the giving of the name is by the bris. So that is when the parents announce the name and proclaim the name, that this would be the name of the child. However, even prior to that, the couple days that the child is without his official name, but already that the parents are planning to give the name already has a shaykhus to the child. So in this case, the name of the Rebbe Rashab was Shalom Doiv Ber. The Doiv Ber, the Rebbe explained, is named after the Mittler Rebbe. And in the Emes, it is 3 names. It is the name Shalom, Doiv, and Ber. Shalom, Doiv are names of Kedusha. What's the pshat names of Kedusha? These are Hebrew words. Ber is not a Hebrew word. Ber is a Yiddish word. Incidentally, the Rebbe doesn't mention it, but there is no name Ber only, which means Ber is not a name in itself. It always can come together with a Hebrew name. However, Ber in itself is not a name. A beer.
What?
A beer.
Beer.
A beer.
Oh.
To say, there's no barrel. Berel always, whenever we'll find an individual with the name Berel, he has another name to it. Why? Because Berel in itself is not a Hebrew name. Always, every person has his Hebrew name. Doiv Berel can be a name, because, so it already comes together with Doiv. The Rebbe says if we will look carefully, the way the Rebbe Rashab would sign his name, he would not sign it as three different words, Shalom Doiv Ber. He would sign it as two words. Shalom is one word, and Doiv Ber he would usually combine. Duber, he would, instead of writing Doiv Ber, he would write it with one base, which this one base would combine both words, the Doiv and the Ber. The Rebbe went on to explain what is the inyan of a bear. So, ber, what is the nature of a beer? A beer is heavily in basa, very heavily in flesh. And at the same time, the Rebbe said, if we would go into a zoo and follow the attitude of a beer, the way a beer stands in this cage, we will always see that the teva of a beer is to bizech misnaneya. A beer shakes himself, shakelt sich. What does this show? Rebbe shakes. Not standing still, constantly moving.
Ein lehem menucha, that's the idea.
Excuse me. So the Rebbe explained it as follows. The basa, that's the idea of Gashmias. For example, we find, it's explained in Hasidus, that when the Yidden left the Midbar, the Yidden were asking for basa. Moshe Rabbeinu claimed, Ma'ayin li basa. Moshe Rabbeinu said that he has no shaychus to basa. He cannot be mamshich, bring down basa to Yidden. So what do we see from this? That basar is something which stands for Gashmias. The idea of Gashmias is reflected in basar, meat. So Moshe Rabbeinu claimed, Ma'ayin li basar, he is not in a position of being, he's higher than being mamshich basar to Yidden. The Yidden he does not see himself in a position of having any shaychus to basar. What is the pshat doiv ber? So the ber, on one hand, he has the tchuna, he has this nature of having basar on him, an excess of basar, and at the same time a bear is constantly moving, constantly shaking. The Rebbe explained this is the idea. What do we take from this? From this we take a lesson, a hiroya, which is equal to all of us, that on one hand there are nyonim gashmiyim, which stand as obstacles in our way of serving the Rebishter, but at the same time we are taking the lesson from the bear and shaking the pshat. We're not standing on one place to constantly move. And this is the demand of a Yid, that a Yid constantly has to keep on going higher and higher, never stand steady on a place, constantly be mailam bekodesh. What did the Rebbe Rashab do? He combined the name of Doiv and the name of Ber and made one word out of it. What's the pshat? Ber is an Indian of Choyl. Doiv is an Indian of Kedusha. What did the Rebbe Rashab introduce, and what does he demand? What does this demand from all of his followers and from us Hasidim today? To take inyanim of Kedusha and combine it with inyanim of Choyl. In other words, that Choyl, vachadike Sachen, Gashmiisdike Sachen, should not remain purely Gashmiis, but Gashmiis should become associated with Kedusha. Together with this, his name was Shalom. Shalom means peace. And whenever we find the expression of Shalom, it is always explained an inyan of Shalom, of making peace between Pamalya Shalmaila and Pamalya Shalmata, making peace between inyanim, heavenly inyanim, and mata inyanim. This is also the same idea. This also brings out the thought how a Yid is supposed to take inyanim Gashmiyim and make peace between Gashmiyas and Ruchniyas. In other words, see to it that that Gashmiyas should not stand as an interference and remain Gashmiyas without any shaychus to Ruchniyas. On the contrary, the object, the goal of a Yid is to be Mesim Shalom, ben Pamalya Shalmaila le Pamalya Shalmata. In other words, to bring Choyl and Kedusha, to associate Choyl and Kedusha, and associate it in what way? That Choyl should become part of Kedusha. And this is the lesson which we can all take from the name of the Rebbe Rashab. Rebbe said that he doesn't recall how the Mittal Rebbe's name was also Doiv Ber, but he doesn't recall at the moment a clear signature of the Predicate of the Mittal Rebbe, rather. How the Mittal Rebbe would sign his name, whether he would sign it Doiv Ber or Duber as one word, But Benegeh, the Rebbe Rashab, he's definite and has constantly seen his signatures and his correspondence that this is how he signed his name, putting Doiv Ber into one word, which this means the idea of associating Kedusha and Choyel, associating Gashmias and Ruchnias, and bringing Ruchnias to influence Gashmias, not on the other way around, Chas v'Sholem, but to see to it that Ruchnias should be associated with Gashmias and have an influence that all the Gashmias should be utilized in Kedusha. And this is how a Yid is supposed to live. And this is a halach in Shulchan Aruch, and this is quoted in the Rambam. That and it's a pasuk which is quoted in the Rambam, B'chol d'rochecha, da'eyu in all your ways, thou shall know him, meaning that all inyanim which we come in contact with and all inyanim Gashmim have to be utilized for Kedusha. Then the Rebbe went on in the second Sikha that today is Gimel Nisan. And if we know that as of Rosh Chodesh Nisan we are supposed to recite the Nasi daily. May I have a sitter, please? So today is Gimel Nisan, and it is also Shabbos. Yes. Excuse me. What is the Nasi of Bayoim HaShlishi? The Nasi of Bayoim HaShlishi is Nasi Livnei Zavulun, Aliyah ben Chayla. What does the Zavulun resemble? What is the idea of Shevet Zvulun? The idea of Shevet Zvulun is Smach Zvulun B'tzeisecha V'Yisachar B'Yalecha. We know it's very famous. What is Zvulun noteworthy for? Zvulun is outstanding. Zvulun were big merchants. And Yisachar, they were big Leimdei Torah. B'nei Yisachar Yodei Bina Litim. The people of Yisachar were extremely bright, extremely brilliant in learning. And as we all know that Yisachar and Zvulun had an agreement that Zvulun was supporting Yisachar, so Zvulun had a share in the Torah which was learned by Yisachar. This was a famous agreement which was between Zvulun and Yisachar. So Zvulun was a merchant taka al pi Torah. As a Yid is supposed to fear zech al pi Torah, and this is how we find. Rabbi says, the pasuk says, Smach Zvulun b'tzeisecha. Zvulun, be happy as you are going out. Pshat, as you are going out, planning a business trip, as you are going out to go out for business for an yonim of Asek, Zvulun is already happy. What's the pshat? Zvulun is already happy. He hasn't earned money yet. How can he be happy? However, Zvulun is doing his business according to Al Pi Torah. And according to Al Pi Torah, Zvulun knows that he is not going alone. It's not just a Zvulun going. Zvulun is going b'koichai of a Meshaleach, b'koich of somebody that is sending Zvulun. Who is sending Zvulun? The Rebishter. And the Rebishter is associated with Zvulun. The Melech says Zvulun knows as he's going out to do his business, he hasn't even done any business yet. He hasn't even made any earnings yet. But he's only on his way to do business. Zvulun is already happy. Zvulun is already in a prin of simcha. So we're talking about Zvulun, who is doing business accordingly as a Yid is supposed to do business al pi Torah. Yisachar is the inyan of limud Torah. Rabbi says it's a little strange. Yisachar's Nasi came out to be on a Friday. Zvulun's Nasi we have on a Shabbos. Shabbos is a day which we know stands for Torah. Kula alma Torah nitna b'Shabbos. Torah and Shabbos have a very close association. So we look, how is the Kviyas this year? The Kviyas this year is such that whose Nasi do we have on Shabbos? Not the one whose inyan is Torah, but the one whose inyan is business. And this is obviously a little bit strange. The Rebbe went on to explain that we find in Igeres HaKodesh from the Alter Rebbe, in the Tanya, in Igeres HaKodesh, which is a component of Tanya, this is basic in Yonim of Chasidus, as we know we refer to it as the Torah Shebeksav of Chasidus. So in the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe writes, what should be the attitude of a Baal Eisek on Shabbos? In Igeres HaKodesh, the Alter Rebbe writes it. And there he writes that Shabbos, when a person is not involved in business, he's free from his entire yoke of business on Shabbos. Shabbos is an opportune day, a proper day, for a Baal Eisek to really daven ba'arichas, to daven long and put himself into davening and learn a lot of chassidus. And this is how the Alter Rebbe explains that who should daven for the Amid on Shabbos. The Alter Rebbe writes in the Igeres HaKodesh, who should be the Shliach Tzibur on Shabbos? It should be somebody who is a Baal Eisek. Why? Because on Shabbos he's not in a rush, he's not in a hurry, so we'll be able to daven really ba'arichas accordingly. What do we see from this? The contrary. From this we see that Shabbos is a day when a Baal Eisek could really lift himself up and act properly and accordingly and davening ba'arichas. Mele the Rebbe went on to explain this fact that we find that by Yom HaShlishi, the third day, is the Nasi of Bnei Zvulun, and who is the Bnei Zvulun? Zvulun stands for the idea of merchants, and this falls out to be on a Shabbos. Adarabbe, this is a call to all merchants, and this is something which should alert all merchants that Shabbos should be the day when they should utilize the Shabbos properly in davening ba'arichas and learning chassidus, the way a Shabbos ought to be utilized. Rabbi said, if so, he saw something very strange in his own shul this morning. He says in his own shul this morning he did not see that people who are balei asokim should daven ba'arichas. He didn't see the people who are merchants should really daven longer than others. On the contrary, he says, not only they didn't daven longer, they may have even finished earlier than others. They may have even finished and rushed and finished before the minyan. And this is obviously contradictory to what we're just talking about. The Rebbe said that the Rebbe Rashab, whose Hilula we just spoke about, whose Hilula was yesterday, the Rebbe Nishma explains in the Hemshech of Taf Reish Ayin Beis, it's a very famous Hemshech of Mamorim. There he explains that there are two ways how one can service the Eibishter. There is one way, barash, bekoil, barash, through a lot of noise, very loud. There's another way of servicing the Eibishter, bekoil d'momadaka, very quietly and very unnoticed and very unseen. The Rebbe says, unless he is to say that these Balei Eisek, who are marich b'tefillah in such a way that they're selecting this way of servicing the Eibishter, as it is explained in Hemshech of Taf Reish Ayin Beis, doing it in a very quiet way, in a very koil demama dakadika way, in a way that nobody should see them and it shouldn't be obvious at all. In such type of a manner, the Rebbe says, he doesn't think it is so. The Rebbe alerted very strong that from here we take a lesson how Balei Asokim are really supposed to act. That a Baleisik is really supposed to utilize the Shabbos because all week Taka has no time. But when it comes Shabbos, this is a day when he really has time for Tefillah Ba'arichas and for learning of Chasidus, and together with the davening to sing a little nigun in the middle of davening and giving a knack with his finger, which all this is expression of the sincere expressions how one really gets involved into Tefillah Ba'arichas. Later the Rebbe went on to explain further this week's Seder. The Rebbe just explained the lesson we can derive from Gimel Nisan, 3 days in the month of Nisan. And this year falls out Gimel Nisan and Pashas Vayikra. Pashas Vayikra is a very general term. Why? Because there are many inyanim which are discussed in the Seder. Many inyanim, many detailed inyanim. And we know the famous saying from the Alter Rebbe, Amedaf leben mit der Zeit, which means to live with the time. What's the pshat b'ayit, to live with the time? To live with Parshas HaShavua. Meaning that we are supposed to take a lesson from the inyanim which we read and learn in the week Seder. Mela, if we are looking for a lesson which we are to derive from an inyan in Parshas Vayikra, it is most appropriate, Rebbe says, not to look any further, but to go to the very general name of the Seder. Because if for some reason the name of the Seder was selected to serve as Parshas Vayikra, the lesson which we can take from the Seder is also lying in the word of Vayikra. What is the Pshat Vayikra? Vayikra called. He called. It does not say who called. It says Vayikra, he called. All in Yonim and Torah are a constant lesson to us at all times. So Rebbe goes on to explain that there is a constant call, there's a constant kriya to each and every Yid. What is the pshat is that not say who calls. We're talking the Rebbe, naturally it's the Rebishter who's calling. But in what level Rebishter? The level of the Rabbeinu Shalom at such a level of anoichi, as it's explained in Chassidus, the loyes rames, loy b'shum loyes, v'loy b'shum koyt, such a level of the Rebishter that cannot be defined in any way. No shame, no name can define this high level of the Rebishter. That is why the pasuk does not say Vayikra Hashem or Vayikra Elokim or any other title of the Rebishter. The pasuk uses a general expression, Vayikra, he called, he, meaning whom he, naturally the Rabbeinu Shalom. But such a level, the lo Yisram is lo b'shem ois v'lo b'shem koitz. And from this very high level of the Rabbeinu Shalom comes a call, a constant call, the Rebbe says, to each and every Yid. And not only to those Yidden who aren't acting properly, or who are lacking in Yonim and are missing in Yonim, but even for the one who is doing everything extremely perfect. He's living up to a standard of Oyeves Hashem and Ave B'Tanugim, the highest level of love towards the Eibishter, and from this level, as a result of this level of love, he's servicing the Eibishter. To this person, there's a constant as well. In other words, to all Yidden, to all phases of Yidden, how high one may be or how low one may be, there's a constant kriya, there's a constant call from this very high level in the Rabbeinu Shalom, constantly calling to this Yidden Vayikra, calling him, and alerting him that this Yid should go higher and higher in the service of the Eibishter. And here the Rebbe related that it was some over 30 years ago that he was in France. And he went to France from the United States. It was after his mother came out of Russia. Must have been in 1947 or 1948. The Rebbe's mother came out of Russia, so the Rebbe at that time lived here already in the United States. So the Rebbe went to Paris to pick up his mother and bring her, Allah Shalom, the Rebbe Tzimchanan, to bring her here to the United States. The Rebbe says that when he went there to France, there were many things which he saw, many things which he was involved in. He was there for a couple of weeks and actually had to spend a couple of Shabbos in there. However, there were things which resulted right away. There were inyanim which resulted within a week, within 2 weeks, or within a year. However, there was something which he saw then, which he didn't think would come in handy to him some 30-something years later at a Hasidische Farbrengen. And at that time, the Rebbe says, when he was in France, he saw Yidden that had just came out of Russia at that time. That was when Lubavitcher Hasidim began coming out of Russia. And Yidden was sitting and davening ba'arichos on Shabbos in a very beautiful manner, at length. In other words, davening very long on Shabbos and spending a lot of time on tefillah on Shabbos. And the Rebbe says this had left a very deep impression on him. And the Rebbe says what's remarkable, what he's disturbed about, in other words, that the same Yidden who at that time came out of Russia, and at that time they were totally broken, now Baruch Hashem, the Rebbe has blessed them with Bane, Chaye, Mezoine, Reviche, everything, they're set up well and established well, healthy and children and children and Parnasa and so forth. But the Rebbe had done, let the Rebbe add yet more blessing. Naturally, we're not satisfied yet, and let the Rebbe bless every Yid with yet more Hatzlacha and Bane, Chaye, Mezoine. But at the same time, the Rebbe says, now that these people were blessed, and the same, the Rebbe says, applies not only to the people that came out of Russia, those individual people whom we met in Paris then, but it applies to everyone as well. He's really, and it was the Rebbe again referred to what he spoke about in the second Sikha, and really demanded that Shabbos is a proper time to see people davening ba'arichas, to see people davening at length, really getting involved into tefillah and into limud achsidus and so forth. And unfortunately, the Rebbe says he does not see it. The Rebbe said, I've heard that there is a famous expression from the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab, when he once said in Indian, he used an expression, sheyifoil bi ubahashemim. He wants that this Indian that he's talking about should have an effect on the listeners, but however on himself as well. So the Rebbe says, so some may ask the question, what is Bnei Geya himself? In other words, where is his arichas? Where's the Rebbe's arichas b'tefillah? The Rebbe says, so, two inyanim. Firstly, the Rebbe says, in other words, the Rebbe was talking into comparison of some 30-something years ago. The Rebbe says he's not getting involved now into whatever has happened within this period of over 30 years. And furthermore, the Rebbe says, enough that he's matriach the audience, enough that he's burdening the audience with inyanim that he's demanding from the audience, from us Chassidim. The Rebbe says he's not going to burden us to listen to inyanim which he's demanding from himself. But again, the Rebbe kept on talking very strongly.
Didn't you also say that they couldn't help him anyway?
Pardon?
They couldn't help him anyway?
It can anyways, the Rebbe says. The fact that he's going, on the first inyan, the fact that he says it's no inyan for him to elaborate about himself now, to get involved in detailing about himself, whatever has happened with him in the past, over 30 years, because
negeya at this moment. And the Mele, the Rebbe again kept on stressing very strongly how Shabbos is a very proper day to see Yidden, to see Hasidim be marich b'tfilah and learn Hasidus, and really get involved into davening, how a Hasidic davening should be on a Shabbos. Then the Rebbe learned a Rashi in this week's Sedre, and together with learning the Rashi, the Rebbe says, as we know, the Rebbe on many occasions explains a commentary of Rashi, and at the same time raises a question which obviously would deserve commentary of Rashi, and Rashi bypasses and Rashi is not meferish anything. And this is right away in Parshas Vayikra, Bichlal, in the whole inyan of Korbanos. So the emes is that the whole idea of Korbanos in Pshuta Shel Mikra requires some sort of an introduction to the child to explain him what is the whole idea, the whole concept of Korbanos. Rashi does not do it. The Ibn Ezra, who is also a meferish that sticks to Pshat, claims that the whole inyan of Korbanos cannot be explained according to Pshat. However, according to Soid, B'derech HaSoid, it has an explanation, and he does not get involved in it. However, Rashi doesn't say anything. And we know that where Rashi does not have an interpretation according to Pshat, Rashi at least says that the inyan can be explained according to Medrash, according to Drash. Where Rashi has no explanation, we know Rashi usually would say, Eini Yodeya or Lo Yadati. Here Rashi bypasses and does not give any general introduction whatsoever to the entire concept of Korban. And why is this? This is something which the Rebbe is raising in the sense of an inyan which Rashi should have explained and Rashi does not explain. Weiter, there's an inyan which Rashi does explain and also requires a little bit of an interpretation, a little bit of an explanation. In Posik Tes, in Parshas Vayikra at the beginning, Kapitel Aleph, Posik Tes, the very end of the Posik is Ishei Reyach Nichoyach Lashem, that when a korban is brought, the korban is a Reyach Nichoyach, a satisfaction to the Rebishter. So what does Rashi comment? Nachas Ruach Lefonai Sha'amarti V'na'aseh Retzayin, that the Rebishter says brings pleasure to him that his will is fulfilled. That's the taich in Reyach Nechoyach. This is how Rashi is interpreting Reyach Nechoyach. The Rebbe says if we know that Rashi's derech is that the first time Rashi comes across a word in Chumash, that is where Rashi has to explain this word. Reyach Nechoyach is already mentioned in Parshas Noach, when Noach built a mizbeach to the Rebishter. And Noach was makriv korbanos, the Pasuk uses the expression Reyach Nechoyach. There, Rashi does not interpret what Reyach Nechoyach means. Here, 2 Chomashim later, in Parshas Vayikra, that the word Reyach Nechoyach is used again, this is where Rashi teaches that it's a Reyach Nechoyach, meaning it brings a satisfaction to the Rebishter, Nachas Ruach, a pleasure to the Rebishter, She'amarti V'na'aseh Retzayin, that his will was fulfilled. As the Rebbe explained, the tenet which the Rebbe gave is that the Reyach Nechoyach, which is mentioned by Noach, as opposed to the Reyach Nechoyach, which is mentioned here, has two different meanings. The Reyach Nechoyach, which is mentioned by Noach, does not mean a Reyach Nechoyach, a Nachas Ruach, to the Rebishter. There it means a Reyach Nechoyach, it brought a satisfaction to Noach. Noach, the Rebishter told him that he should enter into the Teva. And together with him he should take from Behemoth, he should take Chayis Tehoros and not Tehoros. So the Rebishter told him that from the impure, from the non-kosher, he should take only 2. However, from the kosher, he should take 7. So Noach thought to himself, if only that the kosher behemoth should remain in existence, just like the non-kosher, for this there was no need that the Rebishter should tell him to bring 7 of them into the table. He could have brought 2 only, just like he brought from the non-kosher. So later, after the Mabul was over, and Noach realized everything that happened, it dawned on him that why did the Rebishter tell him to bring in more behemoths of the kosher as opposed to the non-kosher. So Noach interpreted it that here he has an opportunity to express thanks and gratitude to the Eibishter, and he took the excess of kosher behemoths as opposed to non-kosher behemoths, and he took them and brought them as korbanos to the Eibishter. He brought it as an offering to Hashem. So from here already we see that the idea of a korban comes, already the child knows that what does the idea of a korban stand for. The idea of a korban is how one expresses thanks and gratitude to the Eibishter. And as the psukim tell us there, ki yetzer leiva odom ramenu, the person from his youth, from his childhood, by his own self, would do evil, would do bad. The mele, a korban, from here we already get the idea that a korban has a shaykhus to tshuva. That it was a korban is an expression of gratitude to the Eibishter, and at the same time it is an expression of tshuva. So Mamela, to ask a question, why Rashi doesn't give any reason or any logic or any introduction to the idea of korbanos, this the Rebbe says is no shayla. Why? Because Rashi doesn't give us introductions to many more mitzvahs. Here we have gone through a few weeks ago Parshas Mishpatim. Parshas Mishpatim is a seder that has within it over 60 mitzvahs, and Rashi does not get involved in giving reasoning for all these 60 mitzvahs which are discussed in Parshas Mishpatim. So we see that Rashi's approach is not to give a reason or an introduction to various mitzvahs. However, here that the pasuk is talking about a korban, and here the korban is brought, naturally, as Rashi told us right away in the beginning of the Seder, a person cannot bring a korban from Gezel. A person has to bring a korban from his own. To bring a korban from Gezel, naturally, it is not welcomed by the Eibishter. But when he brings the korban out of his own, and a korban has within itself the idea of asking for forgiveness and accomplishing the forgiveness, and the pasuk uses the words "Ishereach nechoyach Lashem," that the pasuk states that the korban is a reach nechoyach. So here Rashi explains what's the pshat nechoyach. Nachas ruach lefonai she'amarti v'naseh rotzoni, that it brings about a feeling of satisfaction. To the Eibishter it causes a pleasure. To the Rabbeinu Shalom, a reach nechoyach, an extreme pleasantness. The Eibishter is very satisfied that his will was fulfilled. B'negeya other inyanim, the Rebbe also raised the idea of reach nechoyach, obviously, should apply to all other mitzvahs. Every mitzvah which he does brings about a satisfaction by the Eibishter. However, this mitzvah here of korbanos is more than that. Why? Because the mitzvah here of korbanos is something which brings along with it the inyan of tshuva. The Rebbe spoke at length that, for example, we find by a korban shlomim. Rashi explains weiter why is the korban called a korban shlomim? Because it brings satisfaction to everyone. What's the pshat to everyone? All the participants in the korban are satisfied. Whom do we mean by all? All we mean the bailim, the owners, they get a part of the korban, as well as the kohanim, because the kohanim also get part of the korban, as well as the mizbeach.
You quoted the Rashi.
Rashi said, Rashi right, the shlomim, because it brings shalom to everyone, it brings peace to all. What's the pshat the mizbeach? The Rebbe says, naturally we don't mean the physical mizbeach, it means the Eibishter. So it means that the Eibishter himself is getting something out of every korban. So the Rebbe used this Rashi while asking the question, and he referred to the Rashi again in the Teretz. While asking the question, the Rebbe referred to the Rashi. So obviously the child needs some sort of an introduction. What's the pshat that the Eibishter is gaining from a korban? Here we see that it brings peace to all, including HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What do we mean that it brings some satisfaction to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is getting the emurim, the parts of the behemoth which are remaining and being burnt on the Mizbeach, this the Eibishter is getting. But as the Rebbe went on to explain, this is not Rashi's inyan. Rashi is not getting involved to explain general introductions to mitzvahs, just like Rashi doesn't do it to all other mitzvahs. However, korbanos has something deeper within itself, that a person is taking a complete behemoth, not only something minor. A korban could be given in a something very minor, and a korban could be expressed in a greater gift as well. That a person is taking a greater gift, his own things. Not mina gezel, as Rashi keeps on stressing right away at the beginning, that a korban has to be his own and cannot give anything which he stole naturally, cannot bring that as a korban. And the person is taking something of his own and giving this of his own to the Mizbeach. This is accomplishing also an union of tshuva. As we, not only these korbanos which come as chato, as a chatos, but even in oila also accomplishes an union of tshuva. Remember, this is why this brings about strongly the idea of reach nechoyach, nachas ruach lefonei shamati v'naser etzeni. It brings about by the Rebishter the idea, it brings out a special satisfaction more than any other mitzvah. Why? Because this has a deeper thought within it. Why? Because it's not just a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah which has to do with tshuva, and it's a mitzvah which brings about kapara, forgiveness. Memela, this is why the pasuk stresses here more than by any other mitzvah that it is a nachas ruach lefanai shamati v'naser etzeni, that the Rebbe expresses satisfaction that his will was fulfilled. The Rebbe also referred to several inyanim in the Farbrengen which were spoken about at previous Farbrengens as well. The Rebbe said that in last week's Farbrengen, he was talking about the Miftzayim, and while talking about Miftzayim, he mentioned that when a young girl begins lighting Neira Shabbos Kodesh, she would have to make a Shechiyanu the first time she begins Hadlokas HaNeiros. So the Rebbe says that when the Hanoch, in other words, the script of what the Rebbe said in the Farbrengen was sent into him, this is what he noticed in this. They put it into the text that this is what he said in last week's Farbrengen. Rebbe said he did not intend to say that. Why? What his intention was to say, that being that it is now before Pesach, and if a girl begins lighting candles on the Yontif of Pesach, this is the first time that she lights Shabbos Lich, Neira Shabbos Kodesh, here she has an opportunity to make the bracha and at the first time make a Shechiyanu also. Why? Because we have the Shechiyanu from Pesach. But now that this issue was raised and into the Sichet was put, the Rebbe says, that the first time that a girl sins Shabbos Lich, Neira Shabbos Kodesh, she should bench a Shechiyanu together with the bracha on Hadlokas HaNeiros. Rebbe says, this is something which raises this question. And obviously the Rebbe says this should be similar to the fact that when a boy puts on tefillin, it also raises the same question if the first time that he puts on tefillin, if he should make a bracha shechiyon. Or a similar case, the Rebbe says, the first time a boy puts on a talis cotton, this is the first time he's fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzis. The question is also, should he put on a talis cotton and together with it make a shechiyon? However, the Rebbe says there is a major difference. Why? Pshat of Shechiyanu is, when do we make a Shechiyanu? A Shechiyanu we make when we come across something which brings about a tremendous feeling of simcha, a tremendous amount of joy. At the same time we know, why are there questions, doubts, whether we make a Shechiyanu or we don't make a Shechiyanu? The questions result because the Shechiyanu involves mentioning Hashem's name. And mentioning the Rebishter's name when we are not supposed to raises another shaila of Leisisa Shem Hashem Elokecha Lasha. We're not allowed to mention the Rebishter's name unless we are required to. Memela, that is why we always give special attention, and a special question is raised: should we make a Shechiyanu or shouldn't we? Because we can't be easy about it. It's not that simple. Why? Because if we are not mechuyev to make a Shechiyanu, when we do make a Shechiyanu, then we are mentioning the Rebishter's name at a time when we're not supposed to. When a boy begins putting on tefillin, he's bar mitzvah. At the same time, it is the first time that he puts on tefillin. But on the other hand, we got to see it is an issur for him to mention the Rebishter's name without any reason if he's not required. Why? Because he's already mechuyev b'mitzvahs. Even according to those that fear zich, as in Lubavitch we do, that we begin putting on tefillin prior to bar mitzvah, approximately 2 months before bar mitzvah.
So a boy 2 months before Bar Mitzvah is already into the category of a mufla samuch leish. He's already considered almost an adult. Memeli, he has to be very careful of the fact of mentioning the Rebishter's name unless we are sure it could be mentioned. So that is why there is no shechiyanu by the beginning of putting on tefillin. However, when a girl begins lighting Shabbos candles, at what age does a girl begin lighting Shabbos candles? She's extremely young at this age. Abba said she's either 3 years old, or 2.5 years old, or even 2 years old, at an extremely early age. And the child is very happy, and extremely happy at the fact that she's going to be doing the same thing that the mother is doing. The mother is sending Shabbos licht, and here she's already joining the mother. Just as the mother is sending the licht, she will also be sending licht. This arouses within the child a tremendous feeling of joy. Not only she and her mother are going to be sending Shabbos licht, but all the participants, everyone, all members in the family are going to be watching her sending the Shabbos licht. And in the mind of a young child, all this creates a tremendous amount of simcha. However, on the other hand, with the Issa of Loisisa Hashem Elokecha Lashav, she's not bound yet. Why? Because she's a youngster. She's 3 years old or so. So we don't have to weigh that much and take that much into consideration the fact of mentioning the Rebishter's name when it is a question, are you allowed to mention the Rebishter's name, or are you not allowed to mention the Rebishter's name? Who are we talking about? We're talking about an extremely young child. Memele and Aveira for mentioning the Rebishter's name, she wouldn't have. However, there is a tremendous amount of simcha that we see here, a tremendous amount of joy of her that she's beginning to follow the footsteps of her mother and also bench the Shabbos licht. The Rebbe says, though that he did not intend that when he spoke about it in last week's Farbrengen, but now that the issue was raised, it comes out to be a very, very good idea and a very proper idea that Taka, when a young little girl begins benching Shabbos licht, not on a yontif, naturally on a yontif, Shechayonu said regardless, but the Shabbos that if she begins on a Shabbos, the Shabbos that she begins to bench Shabbos licht, together with the bracha of Hadlokas Haneira, she should also bench a Shechayonu for this very first Shabbos. No, he didn't. He didn't speak about. The Rebbe spoke about it in the Shaila, but in the Maskana he did not firois about telescope. I don't know. The Rebbe also referred to another inyan which he spoke about last week, and this is that in last week's Farbrengen the Rebbe referred that he saw in a sefer that the Baal Shem Tov had the neshama of Rab Sadia Gaon. Rebbe says that was brought to his attention that there's a sefer Shvochei HaBaal Shem Tov. This is a sefer which writes about various stories and incidents which has taken place with the Baal Shem Tov as well as with other great tzaddikim. The Shvochei HaBaal Shem Tov writes that he heard from his father-in-law that the Baal Shem Tov expressed himself, not that others said, but the Baal Shem Tov himself, Taka, said that he was the Gilgal of Rab Sadia Gaon. The Rebbe said that in general, the Sefer Shvochei HaBaal Shem Tov is not too much quoted by the Lubavitcher Rabbeim, so he's not. Doesn't mean that everything that says in Shvochei Baal Shem Tov is extremely accurate. However, in general, B'negei the Inyan, once we're into it, once we're talking about this Inyan, the Rebbe said, B'negei the Inyan of Gilgulim, there are two types of Gilgulim. There's the Pshat. One way of saying it is that a neshama who was once on this world and did not fulfill everything in this world. So this neshama has to come down again and fulfill the rest of the inyanim which the neshama did not fulfill the first time. That's one type of Gilgul. Another type of Gilgul is that the neshama is whatever neshama it is. However, for a special assistance to the neshama, a Gilgul of a certain great person is also coming down into this neshama. And the Rebbe compared it, we find the Gemara tells us, Pinchas Zeh Eliyahu. That Pinchas, the son of Ang, Zeh Eliyahu. The Rebbe says that Mefarshim asked the question, who was before? Pinchas was before, and Eliyahu was later. So the proper quotation in Chazal should have been, Eliyahu Zeh Pinchas. Eliyahu, who lived later, is Pinchas, has a Gilgal of Pinchas within it. Because Pinchas lived before Eliyahu.
The Rebbe explained that the truth is that Eliyahu is a neshama which was created very, very early. And in order for Pinchas to fulfill his mission, Pinchas was Bekanu Kinas Hashem, he needed an extra strength within him. Memela, the neshama of Eliyahu, it doesn't mean Eliyahu who lived in the times of the Navi. Doesn't mean. It's taka the same neshama. The same neshama later came down into Eliyahu who lived in the times of the Nevi'im, whom we learn about in Tanakh. However, the neshama was already created as of Sheshis Yimei Bereshis. Memela, so when Pinchas needed an extra assistance within him, an extra koyach, so that he should be able to be Bekanu Kinas Hashem, that is when Pinchas got as an asset within him also the neshama of Eliyahu. Rabbi said this is also Faremfers, it's brought in Sforim that Eliyahu was from Shevet Dan. Pinchas is from Shevet Levi, because Pinchas is the son of Aaron HaKohen. Grandson of Aaron HaKohen. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen. So how does this come together? However, Pinchas was taking his own neshama, and in his own neshama, fully, he was a descendant of Aaron, grandson of Aaron HaKohen and a member of Shevet Levi. However, to have extra assistance within him, he had the neshama of Eliyahu, which was taken from Shevet Levi. From Shevet Dan. And this part of neshama of Eliyahu was within him to give him extra koyches. The Rebbe says, Memela b'negei the Baal Shem Tov, it could be the Baal Shem Tov was take the neshama of the Baal Shem Tov. However, together with the neshama of the Baal Shem Tov, he may have had within him also a shaykhus to Reb Saadia Gaon, to say that a Gilgal of Reb Saadia Gaon was in the Baal Shem Tov as well.
Is that called Ibur? Is that what's called Ibur?
There's probably. Referred. I was talking very strongly. The Rebbe says we are into the habit of singing, we want Mashiach now. However, the Rebbe says we really got to sing it with taka meaningful, that we really want Mashiach now. Now we taka mean right now. Ayit Shabbos. So he says for those that are really singing, we want Mashiach now with an emes. And it's a proper time, it's the Shabbos afternoon, which is the time of Raiva the Raivin. And as we know, Benegei, the time of Raiva the Raivin, this is how the time of Shabbos afternoon is referred to. It is the highest time of Shabbos. So Rabbi says, so for those that mean with an emes for the coming of Mashiach, they will not be worried what will be with their Shalashudas, or what will be with their, what's going to happen with the Melava Malke. There's another problem involved. There's a problem of Tchumen. Mashiach is going to come, he's going to come from a distance. And we know that Shabbos we're not allowed to go more than a certain distance. And all these problems, he says, are going to be put aside. And what we really have to really want and really have in our minds, that we want the coming of Mashiach now, taka be'emes, without any other machshavas, without any outside thoughts, but really sincerely hope for the coming of Mashiach. At the very end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also mentioned again about all the miftzayim and counted all of the miftzayim again, and alerted all of us to participate in all the miftzayim, and together with it not to forget about Miftzah Sefer Torah, to see to it that each and every Yid will have a letter in the Sefer Torahs that are being written to unite all of Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe spoke that today by Mincha we are beginning the reading of Parshas Tzav. The reading of Parshas Tzav is B'nai Yisrael. So Rashi right away comments from Chazal that Tzav is an expression of zeros. It's an expression of extra rush as far as observing Torah and mitzvahs. The Rebbe portrayed a tziyah. The Rebbe says that the right way to do it is that this tzav and this zeros, this call for immediate action and not to postpone things, the Rebbe says applies to everyone. Not in a sense that the grandfather, the Zayde, will send his Einiklach to do all the right things. However, as far as himself, he'll sit down and take a paper and relax and take things easy. And especially the Rebbe says he has what to rely on. There's a halacha, niya yircha kaidman. First you got to provide the needs of the poor people of your own city. So if you have to provide the needs of the people of your own city, you have to provide your own needs naturally first. So for yourself, you're going to start taking things very, very easy. However, you ain't a klach, then you're going to tell that there's an inyan
there's an inyan of tzav, and tzav calls for a lashon zeros, that things have to be done with an extreme koch, with an extreme zrizus, and so forth. The Rebbe said this is naturally not the way to do it. The right way to do it is that the grandfather and parents should set an example for the children and grandchildren. And Memela, when we're going now to Mincha, today to Mincha, that we're beginning to read Pasha Sav, it calls for a kriya of Ein Tzav Elo Lashon Zeros. This Lashon Zeros applies to everyone. At the very end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also said to announce that tonight there is a Malva Malka taking place in behalf of Yeshivas Toim Chetmimim, and to announce about this, as well as also to announce about tomorrow's Siyum Sefer Torah, that tomorrow afternoon will be the Siyum Sefer Torah, which was written by Beis Rivka. Okay, good to go.